Flyers are back in action tonight. Take on the Buffalo Sabres. You can hear the game 7:30. The coverage begins on 97.3 ESPN. Our good buddy Kevin Durso covers the Flyers for 97.3 ESPN.com. He's back because the Flyers are making a lot of news. There's a lot going on with the Orange and Black at the trade deadline on April the 12th. An interesting trade possibility popped up last night. We'll get into that. Yesterday, they waived Shayne Gostisbehere today at noon. No other team wanted him, so we could possibly see him back on the ice tonight, Kevin Durso.
Yes, we could, for sure. I think that the possibility stands for sure that he could be on the ice. I don't personally expect him to be on the ice tonight. I think they're going to roll with the guys that they have. Erik Gustafsson would come back into the lineup in that case, but that possibility exists. We don't have any real update because there was no morning skate. Alain Vigneault is speaking at around, I think, 4:30 this afternoon, so that'll be the best time to get the update, and we'll find out from there. But he certainly played well enough to still stick in the lineup. That's not the issue, and that's not the reason that he went unclaimed. It has nothing to do with necessarily his skill set or abilities or what he can bring to a team. I think there's teams out there that think he can bring something valuable. It's the contract. As Chuck Fletcher said a week ago, it's, teams don't want to take on term and cap hit in this flat cap era right now. So you're asking a team, even if they completely for free want to take on a $4.5 million cap hit for the next several years, and they're all shaking their heads no. So basically what it means is you're not getting rid of Gostisbehere for nothing and no harm, no foul on your end. You're going to have to pay some of that up probably or take on another contract to do that. And the biggest message to me is it's a willingness to part ways with them. Obviously, if you place a guy on waivers, no matter what his skill set is, no matter what his ability is or what his history is, the message is you're okay losing him for nothing if that's the case. And that's what the Flyers basically said.
Right. So, I mean, if you can kind of hypothesize yourself, why on a random Tuesday at this point of the season did they say, this is the time we're going to waive Shayne Gostisbehere?
I think it has to do with kind of a realization of where they're headed right now. I mean, technically, and we've talked about this, technically they're mathematically in the playoff race, but you're 3 points back of Boston. They have games in hand on you. It's really an uphill battle to make the playoffs, and you've got to kind of realize what kind of team you are and what direction you want to head, not just as the offseason approaches, but get started as soon as possible, quite honestly. And you have to do that before the deadline at this point. You're coming up on less than 2 weeks till this now, and you've got to make that decision. And I think that the realization is that the way the first two periods went in Monday's game, you kind of saw all you need to know. There was no satisfaction from winning that game in overtime just because you came back. It was the Buffalo Sabres who had lost 17 straight games, and you managed to make it 18 because that's the kind of team they are right now. I mean, you're talking about probably 6 inches difference on an empty net goal that didn't go in for Buffalo that separated an overtime win for the Flyers and a regulation loss. And that right there says it all. So I think that that's the realization of it. It's kind of the realization that you have to start being open to the possibilities of what kind of moves you can make. And Gostisbehere is certainly a name that's been tied to that kind of situation, not just this season, but for several seasons. And I think that that's why they ultimately put him on waivers, was to start to gauge interest now, to start to see where this is going to go and see if there's possibilities out there, because they have to start exploring them now if they're going to be players in that area come April 12th.
Yeah, I was, looking at Gostisbehere. Is it a message? Are they trying to send a message, or are they trying to set something else up down the road? I think that's what everybody's trying to figure out. Are they trying to send him a message, send the team a message, or is there a bigger move, a bigger priority here of why that's the guy we're going to pick and we're going to try to do something a little bigger?
Well, I do think that there's, at least in the back of their minds when they put him on waivers, the thought was there. As much as Alain Vigneault said he didn't think he was going to be claimed, he was going to clear, I think that thought was still in the back of their mind that in the event that he does get claimed, let's say a team like Florida.
By the way, is that him taking a little like he ain't getting claimed, or did they are they saying that because they're sending a message to him, or because they know no one wants that contract, which is also a message to him? Hey, buddy, you're not as good as you think you are. Nobody wants you or your contract.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's a shot to him from the head coach anyway, but I think that was just Alain Vigneault being very blunt about the situation, that the expectation wasn't there, and that means that they could still play him the next game. I think Alain Vigneault's thought process is not about whether or not the guy gets claimed or whether he's worth being claimed or whatever. It's I think that was him just answering a question about I can consider him for the lineup tonight if, assuming he clears, which I think he will. So he's in consideration. That was, I think, all that was. But ultimately, I think that they were trying to see if they could. I mean, in the back of their mind, I think that they actually thought that there might be the possibility. When Florida loses a top defenseman like Aaron Ekblad for the season, there's a fit there possibly that he could go and not fill that top pairing role, but fit at the position, obviously. And if that was able to happen, then they get $4.5 million in cap off the books because he was claimed and that contract is gone. And it does open up possibilities. Obviously, it didn't work out that way, but at least it starts the conversation. Teams out there know that Shayne Gostisbehere is on the market. And I do think that there is kind of a collective message to the core group, and the core group extends far beyond Claude Giroux, Jake Voracek anymore. It's Sean Couturier, Travis Konechny, James Van Riemsdyk, like you name it. I think there's plenty of players in that grouping. The message on Monday night during the game was, we're going to put 3 young players on the bench for the entire third period, and it's your job to go out and kind of determine whether or not this is over right now or if there's one more day to live in the playoff picture. And they won the game, and you leaned on those veterans to do it. But the message also by putting a guy like Gostisbehere on waivers and all of that is, there's not a fear to do some drastic things coming up if, this is the way the season's going to go. And I think they're already coming to that realization and coming to terms with that. So I think it is a message to the entire group that things aren't going to stay the same if this continues, and they have to continue to win games and do it much more convincingly than they did on Monday night to avoid really seeing some shakeup.
All right. So Pierre LeBrun reporting last night on TSN in Canada, maybe surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly, get your reaction to this. The Flyers are kind of internally talking about finding a veteran goaltender in via trade. And one of the names they, kind of threw out there is a veteran player, Jonathan Bernier, who, he's a guy who's been pretty good this year. I mean, is that them saying we have legitimate concerns about Carter Hart? Is that, hey, we can't use Brian Elliott every night, and if we don't want to bring Carter Hart back, we got to have somebody. So how do you read into the possibility that the Flyers would want another goal? I feel like this is like 2001, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I mean, they want another goaltender possibly. This is unbelievable.
Well, I don't think they're giving up on Carter Hart. I think it's just a matter of they want him to get the mental reset. And I told you Monday that this is, giving him this week off and being able to space apart Brian Elliott starts Monday, Wednesday, Saturday was probably the last thing they could do short of trying to send him to the minors. And the problem with that answer is, you can't send him to the minors because he's not waiver exempt. So he'd have to go through waivers, and there's a big difference between putting Shayne Gostisbehere's contract on waivers and Carter Hart's contract on waivers. Carter Hart's still on his entry-level deal. He makes less than $1 million. Goaltenders are a hot commodity for any contending team. If they have one and don't know if they have the second, he'd be gone in an instant. So they can't put him on waivers and try to get him to the minors. So I think that if they fall out of contention, I think that if they over the next, let's say, 4 games, this one against Buffalo, they got Saturday against the Islanders, and the back-to-back against Boston early next week. That's your season right there, and if anything, short of winning all 4 or 3 out of 4 happens, then they are looking to shut it down possibly, and I think that that's what the thing is going to be for Carter Hart is I think they just want to give him as much of a mental break as possible, and if you're not in contention, it doesn't really matter who's starting your games. You're already focusing on next season. So now that being said, Jonathan Bernier is a name I don't like because they might, Brian Elliott can only go so far before you feel like you're running him into the ground. They might be, by showing interest in Jonathan Bernier, they might be looking at the only goaltender I can think of who's more fragile physically than Brian Elliott.
He's out, by the way, right now with a lower body injury.
Exactly. He's hurt all the time, and I just don't know how you're supposed to bring somebody like that in and think you're even going to make it to the end of the season, let alone worry about whether or not you have to play Carter. I mean, I'm sure that you could buy some time maybe with Bernier in town, that if you needed to give Alex Lyons some more starts at the minor leagues before you said, oh, you can start at the NHL level for a handful of games. But quite frankly, why not just even start him at the NHL level and just say that that's who you're riding with once it's all over, once you're past the deadline, once the season's out of contention and you have no reason to play for this season anymore. Why not just burn that and let him continue to work like he has been? Because that's, I think, what the main thing is that Carter Hart needs the time to actually work on his game, to mold his game. You can't send him to the minors to do it, so the best thing you can do is give him the time off and let him keep focusing on just his own game and not getting affected by in-game results, which is what I think really gets into his head.
All right, Kevin Durso's with us. The trade deadline is April the 12th, so we still have about two full weeks to go before that. You mentioned, I mean, realistically, Boston has games at hand. They're 3 points up currently. So we should find out pretty quickly here because they have Boston on the schedule 3 times coming up before they get to the deadline. They play Boston on Monday the 5th, Tuesday the 6th, and also Saturday the 10th with the Islanders mixed in there twice. We're going to find out whether or not they're involved in this or not. The Islanders have had their numbers. Boston has had their number. So if that's the case on the 12th, which guys, because I talked about this yesterday, look, you had a good team last year. You felt good about the team. Why? Because you had Hart. That's why you felt good about this team. It's essentially the same group of guys. Yeah, one here, one there. Niskanen's been a big loss. But you don't feel good about this team because Hart's playing so poorly. At what point does somebody look at the makeup of this team and say, it's Groundhog's Day? We keep banging our head into the wall with the same group. Yeah, Kevin Hayes is different than Simmons. They're essentially the same type of player. They score 20 goals. They kind of muck and grind. Do they look to drastically change the complexion of their forwards?
I think they start to, and I think the admission to it was Chuck Fletcher saying the makeup of the team isn't right. At least that's an admission. They could just keep dragging this on and go, we like our team, and do nothing toward the trade deadline and stay put and think it's going to turn around and kind of be playing, with false hope here because they're still mathematically in a race. I don't think they're doing that. It's hard to know which members of the core specifically. I think your first moves just to try to start to break some of this up or just to start to take action in the areas where you can because it's so hard to move large contracts is you look at anybody who's expiring and you see what you can get for them in return. So Scott Lawton and Michael Rothel are 2 guys who immediately come to mind right away. And the rest might be guys who you don't touch until the offseason, but you start to think about them in the offseason because that's when teams are more willing to look at something from the beginning. They start to plan their course for the entire year, and salary cap becomes less of an issue then than it is during the season because there is so much that goes into managing that in season. Off season, you kind of know where you stand with guys who are leaving, guys who you may want to bring in. You explore trades just as much as you explore the free agent market. So maybe that's where something happens. Obviously, one of the other areas where they're going to gain some cap space is the expansion draft, and you're gonna try to get somebody off the books who makes probably a significant amount of money. I mean, the guy who kind of keeps coming up in that regard is James Van Riemsdyk, and that would be $7 million off the books because the whole contract goes. It's like a waiver claim at that point. They select him in the expansion draft. They inherit the contract. It's gone from the Flyers for good. So that would be a significant boost as well. But in terms of the way they've played this season compared to last season, yes, it's the same team, but they don't approach the game the same way, and that's a player issue. You've got to be willing to go out and work hard, and you're watching other teams in the league and in the division go out and outwork you every night and win the battles along the boards and do all the dirty work and find a way to come into the position to winning games anyway. I mean, the Flyers have won a handful of games this month, and it seems like every single one of them they've had to fall into because they've rallied back, and it's frantic at that point in time. And maybe your urgency spikes in the third period in the final 10 minutes when you really have to get it going, but you can't live like that in any hockey season, not even an 82-game season, let alone a 56-game season. So that's really the big problem, is that their lack of not work ethic per se, but their lack of execution and their ability to win those battles, which they were doing so well a year ago, is just gone.
Steve wants to know, can you use Gostisbehere as an unprotected pick in next year's expansion draft?
As an unprotected player, absolutely, because as long as nothing goes, as long as he's still on the roster, as long as they don't trade him before the end of the year, he's still on the roster. So yes, they can still protect. They can choose to protect him. They won't, probably because they've got 3 other young defensemen that they have to protect: Ivan Provorov, Travis Sanheim, Phil Myers. And unless you're giving up on one of those, then they're all going to be protected. So Gostisbehere will go unprotected. So yes, he can be unprotected, and as long as he's part of the roster. So the only way that doesn't happen, in my opinion, is if they trade him.
How disappointing would this be if you went from the feel-good 1 seed? I know you weren't the 1 seed through the whole season, but you ended up earning that, to now a team in disarray almost.
It's highly disappointing because you thought they were turning the corner and you thought that they had some of the other things in place that need to be in place. Let's face it. The thing that everybody seemed to point out last year, myself included, was that the new coach, Alain Vigneault, with the other coaches behind the bench, there were 2 other former NHL head coaches that jumped on as assistants, and it seemed like that woke up the rest of the group, that woke up this core, that woke up the new guys that came in. There was some mild version of a shakeup going into last season because you had Niskanen, Braun, Hayes. They were all newcomers. It was a little different than previous years. And the thought was that seemed to be what did it. That seemed to be what got everybody's attention and got them playing at a much higher level than we'd seen in a long time, and they looked like a legitimate team down the stretch. Specifically, they had rough patches through the season as well, but they never got too far behind in any situation. I don't think they ever lost more than 4 games in a row, and even then they lost, I think a couple of them in overtime, so they would gain points out of it, but they'd come back following that with like a 4-game winning streak or a 5-game winning streak and points in 7 straight or something like that. So they always kept pace. They were always challenging for those top spots, with the exception of 1 in January. So it really doesn't make a lot of sense how you go from one to the other, just other than the fact that, I know it's a weird year. I know there's a lot of things that factor into what you can and can't do, both from an on-ice perspective and the off-ice angle, but everybody else is doing the same thing. So if it was just a matter of ability, then clearly you showed you don't have the same level of ability that everybody else does, because you would just be repeating what you were a year ago, and you're not. So that's really what it comes down to.
Kevin Durso, at Kevin_Durso. Flyers tonight against the Sabres, and then they're back in action on Thursday, Saturday, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, Sunday, then the trade deadline. We will find out if they are in this thing the next 2 weeks. Follow Kevin. He's excellent. Check out all this stuff at 973ESPN.com. He has a preview of tonight's game, his 5 observations after every game over on our website, 973ESPN.com. Yesterday, the Gostisbehere story was by far the most read story that we've had in a long time. That shows you how much people were surprised by that move. So we'll see what happens with that whole thing and this team coming up. Kevin, we'll be back tonight to preview the Flyers and the Sabres on game night with Josh at 6:40. They'll look a little bit more at the actual game. There's the news. Kevin, appreciate it, man.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Mike.
And he, like all guests, appeared via the Boardwalk Honda hotline. Does a great job as always. And, of course, the Flyers and the Sabres can be heard tonight at 7:30. The puck drops on 97.3 ESPN.